First of all, I want to say thank you to SEPTA as an organization for the work that they do with the children and the parents and the teachers and the community at large. And secondly, I want to thank Donna for inviting me back to do this presentation. We were originally scheduled, I think, back in November, and like all things scheduled at the end of October and early November, everything got canceled. So I was thrilled when Donna said, gee, we have another date open, are you available? So exactly, before the blizzard. And, you know, this time Donna really put the pressure on me because she went overboard with this advertising and announcing this, which was great. But like I said, Donna, you really put the pressure on. But I'm glad everybody came. And because of all that advertising, my wife actually knows where I'm at tonight. So, which is definitely a good thing. The first thing I want to remind everybody about is that I have a number of handouts and resources in back, including the bibliography of journal articles and resources that I used to build tonight's presentation. And you may be saying to yourself, what the heck qualifies this guy to stand in front of you and talk about brain development and advances in neuroscience? So I really want to attempt anyway to establish my credibility with you. As some of you know, I spent the majority of my career in this school district as a high school biology teacher, okay? And I just had such a blast doing that. And as a result of my background in biology, and I have an advanced degree in biology, I was naturally interested in this stuff. So when all of this research about neuroscience began to emerge in, I guess, the early 90s, it interested me greatly. So I began doing the reading. There were conferences and brain seminars, etc., that the district supported me in attending, and I took advantage of all of that. And I found all of this information, all of this research so helpful to me as a teacher because it helped me understand why some of the things I was doing in my classroom with my biology students worked and they were successful. And then it also helped me to understand why some of the things I was doing in my biology class with my students just absolutely flopped, okay? So it really gave me a research base for understanding the effectiveness of teaching strategies. So needless to say, we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, and then we're going to talk about some of the differences between childhood brain development and then what happens as an adult. I want to frame tonight's presentation just with a broad brush in terms of some topics that we'll be addressing. I'm really going to start off about talking about the technologies that allow neuroscientists to understand all of this stuff about the brain. We're going to talk about something known as cognitive flexibility, and it's certainly good to be cognitively flexible. And I'm going to have a lot of fun because I'm going to do an old-fashioned biology lesson tonight because we're going to talk about brain cells, we're going to talk about chemicals and information processing. And if we have some time, I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine, Jay Geed, and some of the work that he's done in this area of neuroscience. So, and of course, we're also going to talk about the important role that emotions play in helping children learn, and the role that emotions play, the impact that emotions have on brain development. So we have a really packed agenda tonight, so I'd really like to get started. This is a very exciting time in the history of the world to be in education. And I consider myself really fortunate to be in the profession at this particular time, because we have begun to see more change in what we do and how we do it in the classroom than we have experienced for the past 250 years. Really exciting time. And there are two reasons for that rapid pace of change and development. One of which is technology. Absolutely incredible. And I've been fortunate to be a teacher and work in the school district during this time that the technology is emerging. More than anything, the technology is really impacting how we teach and how children learn. Last week, I was at an educational technology conference down in Atlantic City. And it was, I came home from that conference, my brain was on overload, because there are things coming to us in terms of educational technology that are absolutely mind-boggling. They're, in my personal and professional opinion, they're going to be great for education, they're going to be great with kids, but it's all coming, and it's all coming rapidly. So we all need to fasten our seatbelts in that regard. So the technology has had a big impact. In my opinion, the second reason for the excitement in education has to do with developments in this relatively new field known as neuroscience. And neuroscience is only about 25 or 30 years old as a formal science. And again, and the neuroscience is really connected to the technology, because the neuroscientists now have the technology to help them better understand how the human brain works. And because we know more than ever about the functioning of the human brain, we know a lot more about how the brain learns. Therefore, from my point of view, we know a lot more about effective teaching strategies that we can use in the classroom by taking advantage of this kind of science. And that's really been my mission, to support and spread information to the teachers in our own school district as well as other school districts about some of the impact that this research is having. So I hope to share some of that information with you tonight. And by the way, I have to also tell you the story of going to these conferences. And I was at a recent brain conference and we were talking briefly before the presentation tonight, up in Boston. And the reason why this conference, and it's called the Learning and the Brain Conference, was held in Boston was because most of the speakers were from MIT, they were from Harvard, they were from Yale, and they were from Massachusetts General Hospital. And I have to tell you, these scientists were as interested in what we had to say as teachers as the teachers were interested in the research. They wanted to hear about what was going on in their classrooms. And anytime you have an overlap of disciplines like that, science and education, neuroscience and teaching, anytime there's an overlap like that, that means that we're pushing the envelope. We're learning more. That interdisciplinary development of knowledge is hugely important for the scientist, as it is for all of us as teachers as well. I also want to establish with you the fact that I'm not the only person who feels this stuff is worthwhile and interesting. Here's a screenshot of a cover from a professional journal that's called The Scholastic Administrator, and here's the lead story: the new brain research, how to use it to improve your school now. Here's another article that came out this month: Neuroscience in Schools, Improving Learning Capacity for Young Adults. For young students. Here is one of the Learning and the Brain conferences here that took place up in Boston. This one, by the way, was recently in November, and the theme of this year's fall Learning and the Brain conference is using individual brain differences to teach and reach all learners. How cool is that, right? An entire conference with scientists and educators and physicians with that theme. So I just need everybody to understand that this is all cutting edge kind of stuff. Oh, by the way, I found this one. This is Peabody Vanderbilt University. They are offering the first doctorate in educational neuroscience. Again, the overlapping of the fields, educational neuroscience. There are tons of stuff. There are tons of stuff on the web. This is one of the sites that I use, and it's called The Brain and Learning, and it's a subset on edweb.net, and we have all of these distinguished folks here that are part of this network where all of this information is shared. So there are tons of information available on the internet. All of the resources tonight I pulled down from a site that's called SFN.org, and that's the Society for Neuroscience. And there are a wealth of educational materials available for parents, for teachers, etc., about all of these kinds of studies. I mentioned before in my introduction that one of the areas I wanted to talk about was the development of the technology that enables the neuroscientists to learn about the brain. So I want to look at this a little bit historically. Originally, the only way that doctors or scientists or whoever were able to learn about the brain was either in autopsy, when somebody died, you pulled off their top of their skull and you looked at and you examined the brain for gross abnormalities. The other way that scientists or physicians or researchers learned about the brain was from disease. Think about it. If a person had a disease in a certain part of their brain and then they weren't able to see, for example, then there would be some malfunction in the part of the brain that controls sight. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. But then technology began to develop. And one of the first technologies that developed was the X-ray. However, the X-ray wasn't even helpful in terms of the development of information about neuroscience, because X-rays, as we see here, they only were able to show hard tissue. And the brain is soft tissue. So X-rays weren't helpful at all in this regard. Then came along CAT scans, computerized axial tomography. Anybody have a CAT scan here? That's a pretty common thing. I've had them myself. And one of the advantages of a CAT scan, and one of the advantages a CAT scan has over an X-ray, is that a researcher, a doctor, whoever, can actually see some soft tissue. For example, here in this specimen, you could see the cerebral cortex here. This is the cerebellum that really helps with coordination and movement. And if you're learning to swing a golf club or hit a baseball or kick a soccer ball, that's really where that action is taking place. So even the jump from X-rays to CAT scans was only marginally helpful. And then a little bit later on, in the late 70s, the early 80s, a technique is developed that's called magnetic resonance imaging. Okay, magnetic resonance imaging. And many of you may have had an MRI as well. And there's a variation of an MRI that's called a functional MRI that actually shows some information about brain development. But the real development occurred a little bit later on in the 80s, and it was called a SPEC, or for short, a PET scan, and that stands for single positron emission computerized tomography. And essentially what it does is that this kind of technique allows researchers to look at a functioning brain, because it literally paints, digitally of course, a picture of the brain based upon how it uses glucose or how it uses sugar, and it measures sugar uptake, and then that's an indication of brain activity, okay? So the real, from X-ray to CAT scans to MRIs, and now there are PET scans. And it's this PET scan that is really the very, very valuable kind of diagnostic tool. Here's the MRI, and again, you more or less get a routine soft tissue X-ray view of the brain. But all of these colors in the PET scan indicate different levels of activity in the brain, and of course the warmer the color, the yellows, the oranges, the reds, that indicates that there is a very, very high level of activity going in the brain. So this really opened the door to some very, very incredible research. When I was at one of these conferences up in Boston, we took a little side trip and we actually went to the PET scan lab at Massachusetts General Hospital, and we saw some very, very eager graduate students sticking their head in the PET scan, getting measured, okay? So that's some neat stuff, and that's the advantage of doing that in Boston, because there were so many college students, okay? But the thing that, and let me just bring this together, what this technology shows, and what it clearly shows, is that learning alters the brain. When a student, when a human being, when an individual learns something, there is an observable and measurable change that takes place both structurally and, more importantly, biochemically in the brain. Learning alters the brain. Originally, it was thought that the brain was static, that the brain could not change. However, this research clearly shows that the human brain is plastic. It's fluid, and it does change. And what changes the brain? It's experience and it's learning. There was the old paradigm that up to a certain age, you couldn't learn anymore, or you were born with fixed intelligence. None of that is substantiated by the research. And this whole ability of the brain to change is called neuroplasticity. Will you say it with me, please? Neuroplasticity. I love when you talk like that. That's great. That is great. Neuroplasticity. Now, I want to give you an example of neuroplasticity. Mel Levine, incredible guy. He invented the ant farm. Now, I'm dating myself that I know the ant farm and that I had an ant farm, okay? But in my days of teaching biology in the Sea Wing at Ocean Township High School, we used to use the ant farm, and I want to show you the connection between Milt's ant farm and neuroplasticity. And of course, there was this whole unit on sociobiology that we investigated, and we studied the ants. And one of the things that happens with ants in the colony, in the ant farm, and you could actually see this happening. And we did this in the lab, and the kids absolutely loved it. Because, you see all the tunnels and that stuff. But what happens is ants die in the colony, okay? And when ants die, they give off a chemical. It's actually a fatty acid that's called oleic acid, like oleomargarine. That's the fatty acid in margarine. Dead ants give off oleic acid. Now, that's something you could really talk about at a cocktail party, right? Dead ants giving off oleic acid. So, and the reason they give off oleic acid is because the worker ants, they can sense oleic acid. So they can go around the colony, and because they're able to sense oleic acid, they pick out the dead ants and they dump them someplace else. Otherwise, the colony would just eventually die, okay? Now, what we did in the lab was we would take live ants And then we could buy, through the chemical suppliers, I had an unlimited supply of oleic acid in the lab. And we would go down and borrow some little paint brushes from the art class, and we would paint the live ants with oleic acid, and we would put them back into the ant farm. And lo and behold, what would happen is that the worker ants would go, and even though the ant was alive, because they smelled the oleic acid, they would still take the ant out. Okay? So my point here is that lower species, like ants, their brain is not plastic. The brain of ants does not demonstrate neuroplasticity. Okay? Incredible. However, let me give you this example of a human. Through PET scans, we know that and I need you to think about this, because the first time I heard it, it was absolutely incredible. And this is done in the PET scan, when a blind person is reading Braille, their occipital lobe is stimulated, and the and the occipital lobe, pressing the wrong button, and the occipital lobe is back here, and that's what controls sight. So just think about that. Even though a person can't see, but they're reading Braille, and the occipital lobe of the brain is being stimulated as though they were a sighted person. The human brain is plastic. It can change and it can adapt to different situations. And I just thought that comparison between the lowly ant in the ant farm and a blind person reading Braille really demonstrates this whole idea of neuroplasticity. And again, that means that the brain changes, and everything we do in a classroom changes the brain of the students in our class. Everything parents do at home with their children changes the brain of the students in a measurable and observable way. For example, and here are some other kinds of PET scans, and the brain lights up and so forth. This PET scan, these analyses are so sophisticated that the PET scans can show the part of a brain that is stimulated when a student is solving a math problem. The PET scans can show the part of the brain that's stimulated when a youngster is reading poetry. It is so sophisticated that the PET scans can show the different parts of the brain that are activated when a student is speaking either in the active or the passive voice. That shows you how sophisticated, and that's sophisticated, but just think of what a valuable diagnostic tool that is for a neuroscientist, okay? And think about the implications. If there is a malfunction, if there is a tumor in a certain part of the brain, and it's affecting a child's ability to read, a child's ability to learn, all of these diagnostic tools are very, very important for all of us, but particularly in education. It is incredible for children to be growing up here in 2013. Absolutely amazing. Again, I think it's an exciting time. I think it's a good time. However, it is unprecedented because of the kinds of external factors, again, keeping in mind that the brain can change. Here are some of the things that are affecting the development of children's brains, and they include emotionally laden messages. Imagine what the impact on children is if they see or if they saw anything related to the Newtown thing. Imagine the impact on the kids at the time of September 11th or back in Columbine. All of those emotionally laden messages have a definite impact. And if those kinds of messages are sustained over a long period of time, the impact on a developing brain becomes even more significant. Multimedia bombardment. We live in a world of multimedia bombardment. It's incredible. Whether you're working on a laptop or you're working on a tablet or a desktop, absolutely incredible. And we have at home on our cable system Turner Classic Movies. Does anybody know about that channel? Okay. And I tell you, when I have a rough day, and it's during the week, I go to the Turner Classic Movie Channel because the other night, Key Largo was on, right? A classic. But the reason why it just calms my brain is because, unlike the MTV generation or anything else that's on TV, the scenes never changed. You know, if you watch any of these shows on TV, HBO or whatever, the image changes like every 3 seconds, okay? Personally, my brain can only take that for so long, which is why all of these old black and white films, they could be what they considered at that time high action, to me completely relaxing. But again, the point is that shows you the impact of that kind of image and that kind of activity, and for some children that could be, and particularly in school, that could be incredibly, incredibly distracting, okay? Rapidly changing input, that goes along with the computer generation, variation in family patterns, and certainly this whole idea of diet, nutrition, and drugs. And we'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail momentarily. A child's brain is constantly changing. And let's see exactly what that's about.
Dr. Jay Geed heads to work. He too is grappling with the teenage world, trying to untangle the workings and wirings of the adolescent brain. This doctor is crossing over a new threshold to a fresh understanding of adolescence.
I think people for generations have been fascinated by teen behavior and what is happening in teens. But for so long to actually look inside the biology of teen behavior has been very elusive. And we just haven't had the technology or the tools to try to peer into the so-called black box.
But now he does. Dr. Geed of the National Institute of Mental Health gets the use of this imaging machine one night a week to look at the brain structure of normal children. Teens come in and sometimes even sleep in this large magnet, so he can take a long, hard look inside their brains.
Now, for the first time in our human history, we can actually start exploring the living, growing activity of the human brain. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off.
What he discovered in the all-important part of the brain that sits behind the forehead, in an area called the frontal cortex, was an unexpected growth spurt, an overproduction of cells just before puberty.
This is a process that we knew happened in the womb, maybe even the first 18 months of life. But it was only when we started following the same children by scanning their brains at 2-year intervals that we detected a second wave of overproduction. And this second wave of overproduction is manifest by an actual thickening in the gray matter, or the thinking part, in the front parts of the brain.
Many people mistakenly believe that most of the changes occurred in the first few years of life, and that after a child was about 3, there was actually relatively little change occurring. And we know that that's absolutely incorrect.
Well, I think the most surprising thing has been how much the teen brain is changing. By age 6, the brain's already 95% of its adult size. But the gray matter, or thinking part of the brain, continues to thicken throughout childhood as the brain cells grow extra connections, much like a tree growing extra branches, twigs, and roots.
It's like this. The brain grows like a tree. First, there is a flurry of growth. Then unused branches or pathways are pruned. And it is this pruning that gives the tree its shape for the future.
I'll hold this in position because it has to have a little bit of an angle. You want to tighten this clamp. Run up with your fingers through it.
For Charlie, as he works in his uncle's garage, the skills he's acquiring will strengthen certain neural pathways. What he practices will combine with his own genetic heritage to consolidate the wiring in certain parts of his brain and not others.
Last time we want to hold this thing a little bit.
Only hold it right there?
Yes, right there is perfect.
The pruning down phase is perhaps even more interesting because our leading hypothesis for that is the use it or lose it principle. Those cells and connections that are used will survive and flourish. Those cells and connections that are not used will wither and die. So if the teen is doing music or sports or academics, those are the cells and connections that will be hardwired. If they're lying on the couch or playing video games or MTV, those are the cells and connections that are going to survive.
It is not only what a teenager does that matters, but how old he is and what the immature brain is capable of doing. Some areas coordinate and oversee others, and it is those parts of the brain that have long interested neuroscientists.
We've known for a long time that what we actually call the prefrontal cortex, the part that sits behind your forehead, is involved in planning behavior, your use of strategies, a technical term we call cognitive flexibility, which is can you change your mind and do you have sort of a fluid way of going about solving problems.
Part of the brain that is the so-called CEO or the executive of the brain is still being built during the teenage years. Teens are capable of enormous intellectual and artistic accomplishments. But that basic part of the brain that gives us strategies and organizing and perhaps warns us of potential consequences isn't fully on board yet.
The risks of a severe concussion or a turned ankle, for instance. An adult brain might call for a helmet here or suggest this is not quite the moment to take a drag. But when you're very good, very determined, and very young, it's easy to feel invulnerable.
On some occasions I wear helmets, but not that much. I come here almost every day, so it's not that much for me if I fall, because I'm kind of used to it. I just get little scrapes. No, it's not that risky.
Well, not that risky would be one way to put it.
One of like the most common, either rolling or wrists.
Adolescence has always been a period of high risk. We know that teenagers engage in risky behavior, and they have always engaged in risky behavior. There's nothing new about that now. And because the child, the 13 or 14 or 15-year-old, still has an immature frontal cortex, they often do not make the most responsible, reasoned decisions. And by virtue of having things available that can do harm, they often wind up in a higher risk group than I experienced as a child myself.
Of drugs, for instance. Here at a rave party, ecstasy and other drugs are a kind of rite of passage.
When you're on E, you love everyone. Like, I love you.
Very similar to San Francisco, 1969.
The way you feel, like your hands are soft, you can touch your face, your skin is very, very soft. People touch you, it's nice.
It's also a particularly cruel irony of nature, I think, that right at this time when the brain is most vulnerable is also a time when teens are most likely to experiment with drugs or alcohol. If they're doing drugs or alcohol that evening, it may not just be affecting their brains for that night or even for that weekend, but for the next 80 years of their life.
Again, in this little segment, you saw some of the kinds of environmental impacts on a developing brain, particularly in adolescence. I want to take some time to look at the human brain. Human brain, 3 pounds and is about the size of a grapefruit, okay? In the classroom, just imagine that. In your typical classroom, say, 20 students in there, 60 pounds of brains in front of the teachers, okay? 60 pounds of brains. Keeping in mind, those brains will all be changed by what's going on in that classroom. And that's an incredible, incredible responsibility that all of us as teachers share, the impact on those brains. The brain itself is mostly water. It's actually 78% water, 10% fat and 8% protein. So fat in the diet is definitely a form of brain food. The problem for us becomes when the amount of fat exceeds what the brain needs, and we'll take a look at the role that fat plays in the microscopic structure of the brain. By the way, this covering of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. And if you were to take, if I was to have a brain in here and we were to peel off the cerebral cortex and spread it out, it would be about the size of a large pizza. Okay, so the next time you eat pizza, I want you to think about the size of the cerebral, cortex. And you heard my friend Jay Geed and his associate talk about the fact that the prefrontal cortex is the executive center. That's where all of the higher order thinking, decision making, planning, logic takes place in the human brain. Let me just read through for you some bulleted items about problems that are associated with the prefrontal cortex and see if any of these seem familiar to you. They include short attention span, distractibility, lack of perseverance, impulse control problems, hyperactivity, chronic lateness, poor time management, disorganization, procrastination. It sounds like me in high school. Isn't that amazing? Right? Okay, you know someone like that. There's more. Lack of emotion, misperceptions, poor judgment, trouble learning from experience. You did that before, and now I got to tell you again. How many times do we have to tell kids that, right? Short-term memory problems, okay? I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning. Social anxiety, and this one I love, and this is identified from a very reliable scientific source as a malfunction of the prefrontal cortex, and it's called test anxiety. Okay, test anxiety. The kids would have a ball with that. But again, I'm trying by describing some of the symptoms of malfunction, you get an idea of the overwhelming responsibility that the prefrontal cortex has in managing student behavior. We're also aware of differences between the male and the female brain. That's one of the things that we as teachers deal with in the class all the time. We didn't need research to tell us that little boys learn a little bit differently than little girls, okay? Little girls grow up many times playing school, okay? Little boys throw rocks at cars. It's what we do, okay? But in addition to those gender differences, keep in mind, again, I talked about our typical class with 20, 25 kids, 60 pounds of brains. The research tells us, this research from neuroscience and cognitive psychology tells us that in the average class, let's take 5th grade. How old are 5th graders? 10, 10 and a half, something like that. There can be as much as plus or minus 5 years of developmental difference. And now that's the extremes. That's the extremes. And I see the teachers out here saying, boy, you got that right. So in your 5th or 6th grade class, you can have 10 or 11-year-olds acting like they're 13. Those are usually the girls. Or you could have kids in that 5th or 6th grade class acting like they're 7 or 8. Who's that? Usually the boys, okay? There's that whole developmental difference. Another statistic from this area of cognitive neuropsychology tells us that 1 out of 5 kids in any typical class will have a level of dyslexia that we as a school district have been unable to diagnose. That's absolutely, and 1 out of 5 kids in a typical classroom has some level of dyslexia. And that comes from a Scientific American article that was done a few years ago when a lot of the research about dyslexia was coming out. The point I'm talking about with all of these possible malfunctions of the prefrontal cortex, these differences in developmental stages, the dyslexia, special need, it's not easy being a teacher anymore. It's not easy to be a teacher. And that's why all of us in the profession attempt to integrate all of the kind of information, not only from neuroscience, but also from developmental psychology, differentiated instruction, etc. Chalk and talk doesn't make it anymore, okay? You chalk and talk to students now, you're like from another planet, okay? So that's why that's really one of the values of the technology in the classroom. Back to the boys. Boys are 3 times more likely than girls to have attention deficit disorder, okay? And there are a number of reasons for that related to hormones and chromosomes and that sort of thing. This is an amazing one for me. 85% of the world's stimulant medication is prescribed to not only boys, but to American boys. Absolutely incredible. And nationally, boys account for 70% of the D's and F's, okay? So there's definitely a correlation that's going on here. Let's get back to the biology. The functional and structural unit of the nervous system is the neuron, okay? And this is a diagrammatic representation of a neuron. A real neuron under a microscope looks absolutely nothing like this, okay? I can assure you. But nevertheless, the neurons have dendrites, and those are sensory parts of a neuron. They take in information from the environment. Then that information processed by a cell body is passed down the axon. And the axon is really the motor section of the neuron. So you have sensory motor relationships. And then here are terminals that are called synaptic terminals. And that's really the place where I want to go. By the way, this myelin sheath, that's all the fat. That's one of the reasons we need fat, because the myelin sheath around a nerve cell helps to facilitate transmission, the electrical transmission of a nerve impulse, okay? Now there's a reason why I'm telling you all of this. Because when nerve cells connect, they connect with each other across a space. And this space is called, the space here is called a synapse. And a nerve impulse, as it comes down a nerve, is essentially electrical in nature. But in order to go across this synapse to connect with another nerve cell, there needs to be transmitters that carry that impulse across. The research from neuroscience tells us that the physiological definition of learning is when 2 nerve cells connect, okay? But in order to transmit information between cells, the cells incorporate these neurotransmitters. Children's behavior and learning are influenced by these neurotransmitters. And here are some examples. They are affected by cortisol, serotonin, endorphins, melatonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. If you recall before, I said that everything a teacher does in a classroom affects a child's brain. The reason it affects the child's brain is because it impacts the production and use of these neurotransmitters. For example, cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. When a person is under stress, your cortisol goes up. Sustained levels of cortisol are detrimental to human health. There's nothing wrong with stress. Stress has a place in life, and stress has a place in learning. The key for students and the key for teachers is to know what the appropriate level of stress is all about. If a child is under chronic stress all of the time, the impact of those high cortisol levels have a negative effect on that child's brain and on that child's brain development. Okay? So it's okay to have a little stress over tomorrow's science test, but yet to have stress in a child because they're worried about going home and being physically abused, or if there's substance abuse at home, that's what I'm talking about, chronic stress. And for us as adults, if you're in a situation on a job where you are under stress all of the time, we better be doing something to moderate that, because sustained levels of stress have serious impacts on health. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter associated with self-esteem, okay? Lack of serotonin as a neurotransmitter, or something interfering with serotonin, is one of the causes of depression, okay? Endorphins come derived from the term endogenous morphine. That's a natural type of morphine that's made by cells. If anybody in here is a jogger, or if you exercise, you know what the endorphin rush is all about, okay? You can get literally addicted to exercise because of the euphoria that endorphins produce in the human brain. Case in point, a female in labor produces 10 times the normal amount of endorphins. Melatonin controls the circadian cycle. In other words, the sleep-wake cycle. Light goes down, melatonin goes up, you go to sleep, okay? That's why many times in my own classroom, I saw the phenomenon of I was showing an instructional video, okay? And I would show an instructional video, and I would turn the lights off, and what would happen? The kids' heads would go down. I said, that's not good. That's not good. So, you know, the whole idea is trying to keep the right level of light in a classroom or at home, depending upon what you're doing. That has a definite impact on transmission of neurotransmitters. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter that really affects a lot of what's going on in the prefrontal cortex. And finally, norepinephrine, that's really adrenaline, and that has to do with our responses to fear and threat. So again, in a classroom, everything that's going on, whether it's the teacher interacting with a student or a student in group work interacting with their classmates, everything that's going on there is affecting the levels of neurotransmitters. These studies in neuroscience have clearly indicated that when we call on a student in class and we use their name, the serotonin and dopamine go through the roof with the kids. Absolutely, absolutely. I learned very quickly in my own classroom, because I dealt with some challenging youngsters in my day. One of the most effective things that I did in my classroom, and yet it was so simple, as challenging as it was some days, I stood at the door and welcomed every youngster into the classroom. Every day that I could. When I was the principal at the high school, I stood at the front door in the morning, and as the kids got off the bus, I said, "Good to see you. Have a good day," that kind of stuff. Not only did I do that, but I also had, and many of the schools do this now, also in the background, we had New Age music playing, okay? And it was incredible, the impact that those kinds of things had on the kid. It set the tone for the day, and not only for the kids, but it also had a positive impact on the faculty and the principal as well. So things like, and that worked because all of that was affecting was affecting the levels of these hormones. Everything we do in a classroom affects the levels of these neurotransmitters. Now, at home or in the classroom, what is the single most powerful influence on brain chemistry? And when I say influence on brain chemistry, I mean what influences the production or the inhibition of all of these kinds of neurotransmitters. Just think about it. And the answer is simple. It's positive feedback. Okay? You did a good job on that report for me the other day, okay? I really, really liked your diagrams of the dissection of that frog brain. It was great. It was all, and who knows this better? They know it intuitively, but our coaches. Coaches are absolutely marvelous. That's what makes a good coach. A good coach isn't characterized by put-downs and sarcasm to the athletes, but rather it's a nurturing, encouraging environment. By the way, that works between spouses too. Okay? Positive feedback, positive feedback. And I wanted to show you here, this is actually one of these PET scans, and this came from the Journal of Neuroscience a few years ago, and it actually shows the parts of the brain that are lighting up during positive feedback. You know, that old adage, you can catch more bees with honey than you can with vinegar. There's something to that. And again, here's an indication of that in terms of the PET scans. I want to give you another example of in the classrooms of how that positive feedback and how those serotonin, remember I said serotonin is the neurotransmitter associated with self-esteem. And I'm going to tell you this story, and it was absolutely incredible. And I share this with my colleagues all of the time. I was the supervisor in science for a number of years as well, so I got to go into all of these classrooms and to see the great job the teachers were doing. And there's this one teacher, and actually he was a new science teacher at the high school, and he was incredible. And what made it incredible was that when I went in the classroom to observe, this guy was like reviewing for a test on protons and neutrons and electrons and croutons and all of that. And it was amazing. Every question the teacher asked, every single student in the room, and there were 25, 28 kids, every single student in the room raised their hand. And everybody that the teacher called on knew the answer. This was absolutely, and this went on for all, 42, 43 minutes. And I just thought that and the teacher, good job, you did a great job, fantastic, whatever. So the lesson was over, and I was walking out, and one of the kids was in the hall with me, and I said, hey, Mr. Johnson here, that was just absolutely, I was so impressed with your knowledge and the fact that everybody was participating and you knew I said, how do you do that? And the student said to me, oh, Mr. Lysko, it's easy. Mr. Johnson said to us, when I ask a question, if you know the answer, you raise your right hand, and if you don't, you raise your left. That's a true story. I thought that was pretty innovative, okay? Now don't go spreading that around, okay? I just thought, but again, talk about positive feedback. Nobody's afraid to raise their hand, right? It's just whether you're left or right. Now, I talked about, what was the neurotransmitter associated with stress? Anybody remember? Cortisol. Excellent job. See, I just elevated her serotonin levels there, okay? Best way to manage stress, I know you know the answer to this. Exercise, okay? The link between neurological functioning and exercise, the link between brain development and exercise is as strong as the causal effect between lung cancer and smoking. I have to tell you that. This stuff is out there. And the exercise for all of us, but particularly for students, is so vitally important. And one of the reasons is that it, as for adults at least, protects against age-related decline, promotes the growth of neurons, okay? Brain cells, nerve cells the growth of those cells is promoted by vigorous exercise. And the reason for that is because when we exercise, in addition to raising our endorphin levels, there's another compound that's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And what that does, that's a hormone that promotes the development of brain cells. Also, it stimulates the release of noradrenaline or epinephrine or adrenaline. And again, that's part of the rush. And increases, we talked about the feel-good, increases serotonin levels, the endogenous morphines, and here's the important thing. It reduces cholesterol. Excuse me. No pun intended. It reduces, and it also reduces cholesterol too, but it reduces cortisol. I can tell you for a fact, a perfect example of this. One of our principals, and I won't name the principal who works at the intermediate school, but I know for a fact when that principal has a stressful day, and I know this for a fact, when he gets home, he goes out and chops wood, okay? But doesn't that make, don't tell Larry I told that story, okay? Okay, but he goes home and chops wood, and that is a fabulous, fabulous release. I can't emphasize, sometimes our kids are having a tough day, give them a hatchet, let them go out and, do that sort of thing. But seriously, our teachers know this. And by the way, I gave a presentation like this to a statewide organization of physical education teachers. And I tell you, we had such a good discussion about the importance of physical education when physical education is done correctly, how important that is, how important it is that our kids have recess, how important it is that the kids at the high school, at least every 40 minutes, get up and they have to hustle to the next class, okay? All of that certainly helps. But in the classroom, one of the things, there are learning centers set up around a classroom just to get a student up and out of their seat, going to different sources of information in the room. I was in an advanced placement biology class, right? This is some heavy stuff. The teacher sensed, they were doing mitochondria, all that kind of thing. She sensed the kids were, she said, everybody just stand up and shake out your brain. And that's what they did. And they stretched and whatever. They sat down, they were ready to focus again. What a really valuable technique. I try to use that at faculty meetings sometimes, Change seats with the person next to you, okay? And this one I see all the time, and I think it's a great one. There's a ball, and the kids just toss the ball to the person who raises their hand, and just another way to get kids up and moving. There is a whole national movement, no pun intended, that we've heard of NCLB, No Child Left Behind. There's a whole national movement that is called No Child Left Inside. If you remember that, Google that, and it is absolutely incredible, and it's all about, and let me tell you, I'm a techie guy, I talk about the value of technology, but getting kids up and outside and rolling in the mud and the leaves is as important, if not in many ways more important than their nose in a Kindle or a Chromebook. So all very important. And again, the whole idea is the effect that exercise and movement has on all of these neurotransmitters, but equally as important, the effect it has on lowering cholesterol. Wouldn't it be nice for kids to be in a stress-free learning environment? And of course, the nourishment for production, for structure, protection, and energy. But this energy, the brain is 2% of the body weight of a person, okay? So if you weigh 100 pounds, your brain is about 2 or 3 pounds, as we said. But the brain uses 50% of the glucose or the sugar that we consume, okay? 50% of the glucose. And that's one of the reasons why nutrition, particularly breakfast, and particularly the right kinds of carbohydrates, really facilitate the thinking process and brain development as well. The neuroscience has identified some very, very specific kinds of nutrients. And if you check your multiple vitamin package at home, you might even see some of these. Folic acid. Folic acid prevents central nervous system disorders, particularly in young developing children. So that really is vital. Iron is associated with hemoglobin, which is associated with oxygen, which is another important component in the development of the brain. A micronutrient, zinc, many times overlooked, but zinc as a mineral is associated with the proper functioning of at least 300 different enzymes in the human body. And enzymes are chemicals that control all the rates of metabolism. So that zinc is vitally important as well. The fatty acids, again, for the development of neurons, and vitamin A, essentially for protection in the brain. So again, it's all managing these neurotransmitters as well as the nutrition. The application here is obvious. Promote good nutrition and drink water. There's a variation on that saying by Descartes. Now it's I drink, therefore I am, okay? And I mean that seriously. Particularly the hydration levels for younger children and older adults. Younger children and older adults. My mom, God bless her, 86 and a half years old. She is as spry as ever, and I love her dearly, but I have to call her every week and say, Mom, did you drink 2 bottles of water every day? Because she just doesn't like to do that. But nevertheless, that hydration, remember the brain is mostly water, so that becomes hugely important. I can also tell you the story of when I was the principal at the high school, and all of this stuff came out and bottled water became popular. The kids were carrying around bottles of water, and there was some concern about that. Knowing what I know about this stuff, as the principal, I certainly had no objection, but certainly the teachers are the boss in the classroom, and if they say there's no bottled water in my classroom, there's no bottled water. And of course, the biggest concern from some of the faculty was, they said, John, if you let the kids carry those bottles of water around, they're going to be putting gin and vodka in those bottles and all of that. They're going to have to be going to the bathroom during class. And I have to, and when we said, okay, fine, you could have the bottled water, those things never happened. Never, ever happened. We never had an incident of a high school student with alcohol in the bottle, and visits to the restrooms, quite ironically, precipitously declined. Because many times when kids were asking to go to the restrooms, they wanted to have a drink of water, and there they had it with them. So all of this stuff kinds of evolves and changes. Is there a time for learning? And this is the area of neuroscience research that is called a window of opportunity. Is there a time in a child's development where they can learn certain skills better than others? For example, here are some windows of opportunity graphically depicted. Here's the age in years. The best time for a child to learn music is starting at age 3 and up to about the age of 10. Now, does that mean a child or a person can't learn how to play the piano or whatever after the age of 10? Absolutely not. All that the studies are suggesting is that there is a prime period of time for this to happen. If you've ever read the biography of John Lennon, you'll know John Lennon didn't pick up a guitar until he was 14 years old, okay? So he had no problem with this. But for the average mortal, it's probably would be best. Note that math and logic, very, very early. Vocabulary, best time for to learn emotional control is between this period. That's why it's the terrible 2s and the terrible 3s, and so forth. And this is interesting. Development of learning a second language. Look at that window of opportunity. And of course, this was the rationale behind instituting world languages in our elementary schools. That is only a recent development that came from the Department of Education. And the institution of or the requirement for world languages at the elementary level by the Department of Education was probably the only brain-based decision that they've ever made, but nevertheless, it was there. But of course, that means, and those studies need to be clarified, because what these studies about world languages indicate, that's the best time to learn a world language, but it's total immersion. It's total immersion, okay? So the way we and other school districts are doing it is okay, but that doesn't mean a child by 10 years old is going to be speaking fluent Mandarin Chinese. I don't think that's going to happen. It's all about immersion. I also want to give you some information about a model of information processing, okay? That is, you know, how does the brain, how does the human psyche absorb all of this information? There is certainly input here, sensory input into the brain, and that usually lasts about a second. And keep in mind that this sensory input, it's about 46% of the information that we get, that we absorb through our senses, is through sight, is visual information. About 35% is tactile, or touch, okay? 19% is auditory, and actually auditory information is less than tactile. That's amazing. And the remaining 5% or so is through taste and smell. Okay? So that's how all of that information gets absorbed into sensory memory. And the whole idea is for the brain to take information and convert it into short-term memory, and that has usually a 1 to a 30-second duration. Okay, you know, you look up a phone number on Google for pizza, you get the number, etc. You know, you've lost it after you make the call. Okay, but this research on information processing indicates that the brain can absorb 7 bits of information, 7 bits of information, plus or minus 2, okay? 7 bits of information, and let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So if there's a large amount of information for a student to learn, it is best processed if that information, and teachers know this, we know this intuitively, to break the information down into smaller components. We call that chunking, okay? We call that chunking. The amount of chunks a youngster can absorb is about 7, So that's important. That's important to know. That's probably why there are essentially 7 digits to a phone number, right? That's essentially why there are 7 days to the week. That's also why there are 7 dwarfs. I mean that. And that's also why sometimes we forget the 10 Commandments. Think about that, okay? But the whole key in the classroom is to get that information from short-term memory into long-term memory. And that's really what learning is all about, to take information and knowledge and convert it into long-term memory. And I want to talk briefly about that process. There is a hierarchy of information for the brain. And when I say a hierarchy, I mean that information coming into the brain about survival is paramount. Remember, our brain evolved over millions and millions of years. We are designed for survival. So data affecting our knowledge, our ability to survive is going to have priority over everything else. Data affecting emotions is second, and then finally, data affecting new learning. That's why it's so important, particularly now, for school districts to have a physically safe and an emotionally secure environment for children. A physically safe and emotionally secure environment for students at all ages, Think about how difficult it was to get the students at Columbine High School to refocus on learning after that tragic event, okay? Because their brains, their minds were processing data for survival, okay? So physically safe and emotionally secure. And we talked about techniques for helping children to be emotionally secure in the classroom. In our school district and most school districts, there are other ways we do that. We have guidance counselors. We have student assistance counselors. We have intervention teams to help children and students with problems. Because I know for a fact, I'm teaching science. If I have a student here and she's concerned about going home and being exposed to physical abuse or substance abuse, this kid's not learning anything about photosynthesis. I'll tell you that right now. Until the emotional issues, the emotional concerns of the kids are addressed. And we work at that very, very hard. Kids don't care. Kids don't care how much their teachers know until they know how much their teachers care. And that's real important, and we all work real hard at that. But I want to talk a little bit about the data affecting the new learning. The whole, a major area of the brain that processes learning is the limbic system. And the limbic system is also part of the emotional system of the brain. And it sets emotional tone and stores emotional memories, promotes bonding, etc. But here's the matter about the limbic system. The limbic system is composed of two parts. And this is really the information storage system. It's composed of a structure that's called the hippocampus and the amygdala, okay? Hippocampus and amygdala. This is the limbic system. And let me explain to you the difference between the amygdala and a hippocampus. Think about the last movie that you saw. The hippocampus will help you remember what the movie was about, okay? It will help you remember the plot, the characters, the scenes, the location, etc. But here's the thing. The amygdala helps you remember how you felt about the movie. How you felt about the movie. How incredible is that? One of the references in my bibliography for the presentation tonight is a book by Candace Perth, and it's called The Molecules of Emotion. And let me tell you, it is an incredible read, and it talks about all of the biochemistry of emotion and the impact that that has on learning. By the way, the amygdala is an almond-shaped structure in the core of the brain, and this is one of the ways we remember that the amygdala is almond-shaped. Now, we were talking here, chatting before the presentation tonight about how a child's brain, how an adolescent's brain processes information very, very differently from an adult, okay? None of us remember that we did it this way, but I assure you that we did. And one of the best illustrations about the differences in the way kids process information, and again, keep in mind that processing model, has to do with this experiment on the recognition of faces. Kids were given these pictures of faces, and these were the actual pictures done in the study. And the kids were asked to identify the emotions in the faces of those subjects. And the younger the student, the more difficulty the kids had in telling the difference between being happy and being scared, to being neutral or to being angry. They could not. Younger kids are unable to significantly identify the emotions of other people. That's one of the reasons why kids tease each other. You know, now we call that bullying, right? But because they don't understand, they don't have the mental capacity to understand the effect that teasing has on the target student. They're just unable to do that. And here's one of the reasons. Let's take a look at brain development, percent of development versus age. And if we look, here's the frontal lobe. Remember we talked about the prefrontal lobe? This is basically the graph of development of the prefrontal lobe. And notice that at 24 years old, the prefrontal lobe really is just starting to reach its max. But prefrontal lobe development takes place well into adulthood and can keep changing. But here's the important idea. Look at the limbic system. And again, the limbic system is the emotional system of the brain. So what we see is that because the limbic system develops first before the frontal lobe, kids process information through their emotional system rather than their logic system in the prefrontal cortex. That's why kids get very emotional about decision making, etc., because the emotional system outpaces and out-influences any sense of logic because the prefrontal lobe hasn't quite developed. And there's a number of implications on this, okay? Students process information through the emotional system, and one of the recommendations is to use neuro-linguistic programming when dealing with kids. And let me tell you what neuro-linguistic programming is. It's not what you say, it's how you say it, okay? That's what neuro-linguistic programming is all about. Help students to identify emotions in others. There are actually activities, there are workbooks that have faces for kids, and kids practice identifying emotions in others. And there are a number of computer programs as well. This is one of the big implications because children aren't processing information through their frontal lobe. The use of frequent and repeated reminders and reinforcement is absolutely necessary. How many times as a young teacher I would say to a student, listen, I already told you that. I gave you that. Well, duh, you have to tell kids that again. And of course, one of the most effective techniques to help kids organize and process information is through the use of graphic organizers. And these are tools that help kids pictorially and graphically represent concepts and understanding. This work on graphic organizers began a few years ago up at Cornell University by a researcher called Joseph Novak, and he developed a technique called concept mapping. And I have to tell you, when that first came out, and I still am, I am a concept mapping fanatic. Everything I do is in concept mapping. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud to say that at that time when that research was very hot, I was a member of an organization, and we actually had this researcher, Joe Novak, at the high school talking to all the science and math teachers. So that was pretty cool. So again, just some of the classroom applications. And of course, here's the most difficult, the most effective way to help kids learn is to make an emotional connection. But that's the biggest challenge for us as teachers. You know, how do you make dangling participles an emotional experience? I really don't know. But nevertheless, it's all about that emotional component. And this really is all summarized. Students may forget what we teach them, but they always remember how we made them feel. And that goes back to all of the levels of those neurotransmitters. Just some other applications. We talked about the lights. Telling jokes and humor is so important, and I'm glad that we had a few chuckles here tonight, but there was a method behind my madness. Giving the time of day and the week, a laugh forces you to uptake additional oxygen, right? And that's what a yawn is all about, and it helps you to process more serotonin, and I recognize that. Activities short and accountable, okay? One of the things our teachers know is to chunk the activities in a classroom period. We have a 40-minute period, chunk activities in 10 or 15-minute segments all of the time. Very, very effective. I have to say, use of color. Studies indicate that the use of color increases retention, and we could equate retention with learning, by at least 25%. That's why all of the whiteboards, the marker boards in our schools, they have multicolor. Now remember, they're dry erase. We don't want to use permanent markers on those boards, but all different colors, because teachers can skillfully chunk information by color, and that helps retention. Prime times to make connections. The most important part of a lesson, according to the neurobiologist, is the first part of the lesson. Those first 10 or 15 minutes of a class, because the brain is like wet cement. What hits first will stick. Okay? What hits first will stick. And there are a whole bunch of exercises that we could go through that shows that, in trying to memorize or learn a sequence of events, those things that occur at the beginning are most easily retained. What's the most important thing? We've talked about all of this scientific stuff tonight, neurotransmitters, neurons, prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, amygdala, PET scans, and so forth. But what's the underlying message here from neuroscience? Let some of my friends tell you what that's all about.
Applying new science to public policy has always been tricky, and nowhere more so than in areas that affect children. Take, for instance, the debate over what science has said about early childhood. Parents used to be told that mobiles, Mozart, and lots of stimulation would make their babies smarter. If they didn't do it early, there wouldn't be a second chance. We now know that simply isn't true.
Brain science has told us very little about what we can do to raise our children and raise our children better.
John Brewer is the author of a book, The Myth of the First 3 Years.
Not very many.
What we really have to be careful of here is if we're talking about how fast 3-year-olds learn or what kind of moral decisions teenagers could make, the relationships between the behaviors and the desired behaviors and the brain structure is totally unknown. So this simple popular News Weekly magazine idea that adolescents are difficult because their frontal lobes aren't mature is one we should be very cautious of.
Even Dr. Jay Geed, who seems to have penetrated deep inside the teenage brain, wonders about the kind of lessons parents can draw from his science.
The more technical and more advanced the science becomes, often the more it leads us back to some very basic tenets. And sometimes it's even disappointing to people that with all of the science and with all the advances, the best advice we can give is things that our grandmother could have told us generations ago, to spend loving quality time with our children.
So often what happens in the United States is that we're on a pendulum. We go from saying this is good to this is bad, and then we say what was bad becomes good.
Ellen Galinsky is a social scientist and the president of the Families and Work Institute. She has seen scientific fads come and go, but she says her research for a book about children shows there are enduring lessons for parents.
Even though the public perception is about building bigger and better brains, what the research shows is that it's the relationships, it's the connections, it's the people in children's lives who make the biggest difference.
lot of times, older kids, they seem to break away from their parents a little bit. It's like a feeling of freedom or something. And then they find that when they get into a problem, they want their parents' help, but they don't want to, outright ask their parents.
You'd really like them just to step in and say, hey, you don't seem too, happy today. Is everything okay? Because sometimes, I don't know, I have trouble asking, expressing my feelings if someone doesn't come up and ask first.
Surprise to me, and it's a surprise to every group of parents or teachers with whom I speak, is that kids are actually yearning, teens are yearning for more time with their parents.
Since I was younger, she was always there for me. Whenever anything happened, it's her. She's there. Anything went down, you know what I'm feeling sad, whatever, it doesn't matter when it is. She's the type of person who will always make sure you're fine.
My mom. Ready? Cheer.
Gail Jarvis works 2 jobs. Every afternoon, she heads out for the evening shift, leaving 3 kids behind. Yet even though Gail has to spend a great deal of time away from her children, they feel her presence.
She's always calling from work. I mean, she works till you've been to my house. You heard how much my mom calls her just for not eating food again. My mom, she's the way that she has to make sure that when we get up, when we come home, she finds out how was our day. As soon as we come, she knows the time we come home. Ring, ring, ring. Bitch's mom. Okay. Hello?
Hey.
Hi, Mom.
What's up?
What'd I say?
You
Yeah, we had to leave early. He said he had to go straight to work, so he said sorry. Hold on.
Hi, Mom.
Hi.
What's up?
Nothing? You have to be careful with kids. It's the time when you push them off. That's the time when they really need to be heard. So you have to be very, very careful. Because it's easy to say, okay, call me later, maybe, we'll talk later, but then later might be a couple of minutes too late, so you don't take that chance.
I hate that, how everyone does that. Was that how it was when you were younger?
Bev Husnander spends a lot of time listening to what's on the minds of her kids. Here, she lets us set up a camera to observe a typical evening with Brittany and her friend Leah.
He's been suspended 100 times, so he finally quit school because he was never in school anyway because he was suspended so many times.
For what reason?
She went to class like normal. She was just a little out of it.
Couldn't walk. And then she passed out next to the toilet.
So they just won't listen to us no matter how hard we try. So we have to suck it up. And
the name of my 6th grade report was How to Help Our Children in This Me First Culture. Whatever that means.
I just wanted to be open. I wanted them to be able to talk back to me about anything and not feel that they were going to be reprimanded or thought foolish or insignificant or they didn't know what they were talking about because they were children or because they were kids. I think kids are a lot smarter and a lot in tune to what's going on than their parents ever give them credit for.
Growing up, one of the things I hated, or even when I was an adult in certain situations, I hated that feeling of when I got home, I know there was going to be something that was going to upset the apple cart, and that feeling you get in the pit of your stomach, and I don't ever want them to have that.
Charlie O'Donnell regards his mom as a good sport. But he is still continuously battling for more independence.
I'm going to go to the Air Force after high school, and then I'll get my college paid for, then go to college. Doesn't really matter where. I just want to get out of the house. I want to live in a dorm. No parents' rules. I'd have to set them for myself.
Separation is the whole job of teenagers. And as parents, what we would say we want, what we truly want in our hearts, is to launch them into rich, independent, textured lives of their own. And so in the teenage years, here we get it. And it doesn't always feel the way we thought it would. I have a friend who says that teenagers plant their feet firmly on your chest and launch themselves off into their own life. And that's just how it feels usually.
So I went back and I asked teens, and they said, well, yeah, we are pushing our parents away because it's really hard for us to come out and say, I need you. It makes them feel young, or, you know, they want us to be mind readers. Okay, well, we can't be mind readers. But what they said is, hang in there. If we push you away, yeah, we still want you, so hang in there. When you ask children whom they admire, they often talk about their parents. If they have a good relationship, they talk about their parents.
I tell my mom mostly everything. Like, I don't tell her guy things, but, like, I tell her mostly everything, like, about my friends and everything. I trust my mom with everything.
I admire my mom because she's been raising me and my sister by herself. And if you know me and my sister, you know that she's done a good job.
I think you can put more trust in your mom than you can in anybody else. And I have no shame in saying I love my mom. My mom can be clear down the hall and I'll follow, hi mom, I love you, just like that.
To pull this all together, despite all the science we really don't understand, it's just my job 5 days a week. You knew that one, huh? It's all about the relationships that develop, and that all has the impact on the serotonin levels, all of that chemistry of the brain. And whether it's a relationship between a parent and a child or a student and a teacher, it's all that human connection that really, really is the bottom line. And perhaps that's the hardest thing for any of us to do. But I know as a community, as a school, we continue to do that. I want to thank you for letting me get back to some basic biology tonight. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you.